I welcome the opportunity to speak to you today about the situation of asylum seekers in Australia today. There are 67 million people who are displaced in our world today. That represents 1 in 113 people on our planet. So it's a very large part of our global reality. In Australia, our leaders have defined the issue of asylum seekers as a threat to national security, rather than what it really is, and that is an opportunity for a humanitarian response. And the end result is that we have imprisoned thousands of people who've arrived here in Australia simply to send a message of deterrence to other people. That certainly doesn't seem fair. We can talk statistics and numbers, but it's really the human face behind these numbers that's compelling. And so we have the face of people who are sad, sometimes despairing, sometimes pleading, sometimes proud and not wanting to be seen as victims. But no matter what, these are real people with the same hopes and dreams that we have, and indeed, they're people just like us. Ali, an Azhar young man whose brother was killed by the Taliban, that's a fundamentalist group in Afghanistan. He had been a secretary to a member of parliament, and that's why he was killed. And then Ali's family was targeted. Ali himself was driving down a road that he could not avoid being on, and the Taliban stopped him and made him sell a van to them, the van that he was driving, which was his only means of subsistence. And then they refused to pay him much for the van. So then he went back home and he was very scared, and his baby son at that time suddenly became ill, quite ill. So he had to go down that road again. And on the road, he was stopped again by the Taliban, who refused to let him through. He eventually had to go back home and the baby died. His family then convinced him to leave Afghanistan because he and they were not going to be safe. He's here in Australia, and 8 years later, he still has to get the opportunity to put in an application for protection. He is mentally and physically exhausted, sad, and quite desperate for the family still back in Afghanistan.
The aspect of Australia's response to refugees and asylum seekers that I find most distressing is the way in which it consistently dehumanises people and diminishes them, robs them of their story. I think for most of us in Australia, and I would include myself in this, I cannot really appreciate why somebody would be so desperate that they would flee from their homeland and seek sanctuary elsewhere, knowing that it's going to be a torrid journey and extremely difficult and dangerous. It's impossible for somebody like me to be able to engage with that if I don't see the person who is carrying that story. We are enormously privileged to have this book by Kurdish journalist Behrouz Boochani. It's called No Friend But the Mountains. Behrouz arrived on a boat from Indonesia and Christmas Island 5 years ago and was transported fairly quickly to Manus Island. And in that time, he's been supported by key groups in Australia, and I'd name Janet Galbraith as being a really key person in that. He has been sending her snippets of a book via WhatsApp and text message that have then been compiled into chapters and sent on to a translator to be translated into English. It's not a narrative, it's not a story from start to finish where you pick it up and get the story of his life. It's woven with analyses of the political situation and the social dynamic there, and little pieces of poetry. I might just share one snippet of the story which I think is very powerful, and it really moved me. It's where Behrouz talks of his arrival on Christmas Island. The tugboat arrives at the pier. The waves along the shore are tame. A little blonde girl is bathing there, playing in the water. She isn't paying the slightest attention to us. She takes no notice of the weary and worn-out people, no notice of those standing on the pier. The image of that little girl playing is still fresh in my memory. She is laughing. She has drifted into the kindness of the inviting waves. In the worldview of that child, there is no place for affliction. In her world, there is no space for the hardship that comes from injustice. And then he moves into poetry. She is free. She is innocent. She is like the cool, gentle breeze on this sunny day, my first real impression of Australia. And then, of course, the book moves on to talk about going into Manus Island, and it becomes apparent that as far as the government are concerned, there is no chance he will ever resettle in Australia. And so while that may have been his first impression of Australia, his impressions only worsen from there on as he's stripped of hope as the years go by.
Our scripture is very strong in terms of taking the side of the people on the margins. That's the God of the scriptures. For us, through the lens of our Christian tradition, every human life is precious. No one is more important than anyone else. And if we accept the sort of social teaching that comes out of that, then what we are saying is that the dignity of each person is what's really important. Australia has much to be ashamed of in the way we've treated asylum seekers in the past decade or two. But many people in Australia do amazing work to actually help asylum seekers and refugees. So our challenge is, at a local level, can we increase this support? Let's make a difference. Let's change what's happening.